I found the original notarized partnership agreement nailed to the underside of a barnwood feeder I had built with my own hands 3 summers earlier, the paper stiff and yellowed inside its plastic sleeve, the embossed notary seal still crisp enough to feel with a fingertip. That single piece of paper became the evidentiary cornerstone that landed my nephew in federal prison for 4 years on charges of wire fraud, identity theft, and elder financial abuse. It voided a $500,000 sale he had orchestrated behind my back, unwound a predatory loan he had forged my signature onto, and eventually gave me complete, uncontested ownership of what is now called Wing of Deceit birdhouses. My nephew Ethan currently drills entry holes into bluebird house fronts while wearing a fluorescent yellow safety vest with the words Nest of Lies printed across the shoulder blades in bold black lettering, and every single birdhouse that leaves my workshop ships with a small card bearing a QR code that links directly to his federal conviction record. This is the story of how I built the trap that caught him and how a man who thought he was stealing a company walked directly into a cage of his own design. My name is Margaret, and I was 52 years old when I poured every remaining cent of my widow's inheritance into a partnership with a young man I had helped raise since he was in grade school. My husband Tom had died 4 years earlier from a sudden brain aneurysm that took him between one breath and the next, leaving me with a life insurance payout of just under $100,000 after the hospital bills and the funeral costs, and the dozen other expenses that ambush you when someone you love vanishes without warning. I had never been a financial person. I could strip a mahogany vanity down to bare wood and build it back up with 7 coats of hand-rubbed Danish oil until it glowed like embers. I could rewire a vintage lamp, sweat a copper pipe joint, frame out an entire garden shed from pressure-treated lumber with nothing but a circular saw and a 4-foot level, but spreadsheets made my brain go foggy and investment accounts felt like a foreign language I had never been taught to speak. Tom had always been the quiet architect of our financial life, the one who balanced the checkbook and understood the compound interest tables and filed the taxes without breaking a sweat. Without him, the money just sat there in a plain savings account, earning 0.3% interest, while I drifted through the first years of grief, filling my empty hours by building things. I had a workshop in the detached garage behind our ranch house in central North Carolina, a dusty space with a workbench made from an old solid core door and pegboard walls heavy with clamps and chisels, and a table saw I had bought used from a cabinet maker who was retiring. I built birdhouses from reclaimed lumber I salvaged from demolition sites and barn teardowns, and the discard piles behind flooring showrooms. I hand-painted tiny eastern bluebirds on the front panels, the males with their deep cobalt backs and rusty throats, the females in softer grey-blue, each one slightly different because I mixed my own colours from raw pigment, and I never measured the same way twice. I hung them around my property on black iron shepherd's hooks and watched the real bluebirds move in each spring, a small resurrection I could count on. My nephew Ethan was 28 years old at the time, a tall angular kid with a salesperson's grin that showed too many teeth and a haircut that cost more than my weekly grocery budget. He was my younger sister's only child, the golden boy of that household, the one everybody at family reunions predicted would own a chain of car dealerships or a real estate empire by the time he turned 30. He had that kind of charm, the easy confidence of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. He came to visit me one Sunday afternoon in early spring, the kind of day where the dogwoods were just starting to bloom and the air smelled like cut grass and damp soil. He wandered out to the workshop while I was sanding the roof of a hopper-style feeder and stood there with his hands in his pockets, surveying the piles of finished birdhouses and the racks of raw lumber and the dozens of little paint pots lined up like a tiny apothecary. His eyes went wide in a way that I now recognize as pure calculation, but at the time mistook for genuine enthusiasm. He said we should start a real business together, a proper limited liability company, with artisanal birdhouses and custom feeders sold direct to high-end garden boutiques and eventually to catalog retailers. He said the farmhouse chic market was exploding, that people with second homes in the mountains would pay $300 for a handcrafted feeder that looked like it came from a 19th century barn, and that my work was exactly the kind of authentic craftsmanship that the big box stores could never replicate. He would handle the sales and the marketing and the business development side. I would design and build the products. He proposed a straight 50-50 partnership, which at the time felt almost too generous given that I was the one putting up the entire capital investment. I insisted we do everything properly, with formal paperwork and a notary and state filings, and Ethan agreed without hesitation. We hired a mobile notary public, an older woman named Mrs. Hendricks, who had been a court reporter for 30 years before retiring into notary work to keep herself busy. She came to my kitchen table on a Thursday morning with her embossed seal and her heavy leather-bound journal and her little black ink pad. We signed the operating agreement, the articles of organization, and a notarized partnership declaration, all in duplicate, all on heavy bond paper that felt substantial in your hands. The terms were clear and unambiguous. A 50-50 ownership split between Margaret Carlson and Ethan Riggs, doing business as Bluebird and Beam Artisan Birdhouses LLC. The agreement specified that any dissolution of the partnership required mutual written consent from both members, that any sale of company assets above $5,000 required both signatures, and that the intellectual property, which meant my designs and my paint formulas and my construction techniques, belonged jointly to the partnership and could not be transferred unilaterally. I paid the state filing fees with my inheritance, along with the first year's lease on a small workshop space in a converted textile mill on the edge of town, and I bought a professional spray booth and a new band saw and enough rough-sawn cedar and cypress, and reclaimed barn wood to keep us building for 2 years. The total outlay was just over $99,000. Every penny of Tom's life insurance went into that company. One of the first things I built in the new workshop, before we even had our business license framed on the wall, was a prototype feeder made from a single plank of weathered barn, wood I had salvaged from a collapsed tobacco barn on the property of an old friend. The wood was brownish-grey and streaked with iron stains from the square nails that had held it in place for 80 years. The grain was deep and pronounced, the kind of texture you only get from decades of rain and sun and wind pulling the softer springwood away and leaving the harder summerwood raised like topographical lines on a map. I cut that plank carefully, measuring twice and cutting once the way Tom had taught me, rabbiting the joints by hand with a sharp chisel so the roof would shed water properly. I sealed the whole thing with 4 coats of marine-grade spar varnish, sanding lightly with 400 grit paper between each coat, until the surface gleamed like dark amber. Before I hung it outside, I took my duplicate copy of the notarized partnership agreement, the one I had kept for my own records, and I folded it into a heavy plastic sleeve meant for protecting important documents. I climbed up on a step stool and nailed that sleeve to the underside of the feeder's roof with a single galvanized roofing nail, the kind with a wide flat head and a rubber washer that seals against moisture. I told Ethan I was making our foundation literal, that as long as that feeder hung under a roof somewhere, our contract would stand. He laughed and called me sentimental and said I should put that energy into the marketing copy. I didn't know it then, but that sentimental gesture would become the fulcrum on which his entire scheme would pivot and break. The business grew faster than either of us expected. Our birdhouses were genuinely beautiful objects, and the combination of my craftsmanship and Ethan's sales instincts turned out to be genuinely potent. He got us a booth at the Southern Garden Show in Charlotte, then at a larger home and garden expo in Atlanta, and the orders started coming in from boutique hardware stores and garden centers, and eventually from a few smaller catalog retailers. The real inflection point came when a popular home and garden cable network sent a production crew to film an 8-minute segment about our workshop for a show about American artisans. That segment aired on a Tuesday evening in April, and by Wednesday morning our website had crashed from the traffic, and we had 400 new orders waiting in the queue. We hired 2 part-time assistants, a retired furniture finisher named Walter and a young woman named Carmen, who had just finished a woodworking certificate program at the local community college. We were genuinely profitable for the first time, actually paying ourselves modest salaries instead of pouring everything back into inventory. Then a catalog brand I am going to call Avian Accents, though that is not their real name, reached out with an offer. Avian Accents was a big operation, glossy print runs of 2 million catalogs per season, a customer base that stretched from New England to the Pacific Northwest. They wanted to acquire our entire product line, all 17 of our designs, our production jigs and templates, our remaining inventory of about 300 finished pieces, and the rights to the Bluebird and Beam brand name. The offer was $510,000, contingent on a clean transfer of assets and intellectual property with no encumbrances. Ethan handled the initial call and came to me afterward with his salesman grin, dialed up to maximum wattage, saying we had hit the jackpot and we'd be able to retire early. I should have noticed the shift in his behavior right then, in the weeks after that offer came in. I should have paid attention to the way he started arriving late to the workshop, the way he locked his office door even when he was just making phone calls, the way he held hushed conversations on the loading dock while I was inside spraying finish on hopper roofs and seed trays. But I was too busy filling the backlog of orders, too focused on dovetail joints and paint mixing, and making sure every birdhouse that went out the door was something I would be proud to hang in my own garden. About 2 weeks after the offer arrived, I walked into the workshop on a Tuesday morning to find a man in a navy sport coat, standing in our shipping area with a clipboard and a digital camera, systematically photographing our finished inventory and our jigs and our lumber racks. I asked him who he was and what he was doing. He looked up at me with a puzzled expression and said he was from Avian Accents, here to perform the pre-acquisition inventory per the purchase agreement his company had signed with the sole owner of Bluebird and Beam, a Mr. Ethan Riggs. The word sole owner hit me like a slap. I phoned Ethan immediately. He answered on the third ring and his voice was perfectly calm, perfectly smooth, like he had been expecting this call and had rehearsed his lines. "Aunt Margaret," he said, "I dissolved the partnership last month. I filed the proper paperwork with the Secretary of State's office. The company was structured under my name as the managing member from the beginning, and I made the decision to sell. You'll be taken care of. I'll make sure you get a fair settlement. Don't worry about any of this, okay?" I stood there in the workshop with the phone cold against my ear, staring at a half-painted wren house on my workbench, the blue paint still wet on the brush, completely unable to form words. When my voice finally came back, thin and shaky, I asked him what dissolution he was talking about. I had never signed any dissolution. I had never agreed to any dissolution. I had a notarized partnership agreement that said dissolution required my signature. He told me the dissolution document had been properly executed and notarized and filed, that my signature was right there on the page, and that his lawyer could provide me with a copy if I wanted to review it. He said he would come by that evening with his wife Sloane, and they would help me sort everything out. Then he hung up. I had been erased from my own company with a forged signature and a fake notary stamp, and the people who had done it were coming to my house that evening to help me accept it. Ethan and Sloane arrived at 6:30 sharp, pulling up in their leased silver Mercedes SUV with Sloane behind the wheel. Sloane was an image-obsessed former pharmaceutical sales representative who dressed entirely in cashmere neutrals and spoke in soothing corporate cadences that sounded reassuring until you actually listened to the words and realized they meant nothing. She kept patting my hand and saying things like, "We just want what's best for your health, Margaret. You've been under so much strain since Tom passed, and this business has been so taxing for someone your age." They had brought dinner from an expensive French bistro downtown, the kind of place where the menu doesn't have prices and the portions are tiny and architectural. They sat in my living room on the furniture Tom and I had bought together 30 years earlier, and they told me I should rest. They said I had worked too hard, that the stress of running a business was clearly wearing on me, that I seemed confused and forgetful, and that they were worried. The subtext was a neon sign. I was a doddering, grief-addled widow who couldn't possibly manage her own affairs and needed a younger, sharper family member to take control before I drove the company into the ground. I saw them exchange quick little glances with each other, the kind of glances that plan a power of attorney signing and a nursing home placement and a convenient guardianship. I nodded and thanked them for the food and said I would think about everything they had suggested. Inside, I was already cataloguing every detail. The next day, they began clearing out the workshop. They said they were organizing and consolidating for the sale transition, but what they were actually doing was sorting through everything I had built and throwing away anything that didn't have obvious resale value. I stood in the doorway with a mug of cold coffee and watched Sloane drop my sketchbooks into black contractor bags, those spiral-bound pads filled with 3 years of design iterations and paint formulas and material sourcing notes that represented the accumulated intellectual capital of my craft. She tossed my old templates into the dumpster, the masonite patterns I had refined over dozens of prototypes until the proportions were exactly right. Then she picked up a thick leather-bound journal from my desk, a handsome volume with a burgundy cover and gilt-edged pages. That journal was the last gift Tom had ever given me before he died. He had bought it at a little stationer's shop during our last trip to Asheville, a spontaneous weekend getaway 6 months before the aneurysm. He had pressed it into my hands and said, "For your ideas, Maggie, write everything down so I can read it later." I had used it to jot down my early business concepts and my material costs and my paint mixing ratios. The flyleaf still had his handwriting. When Sloane dropped that journal into a bag full of sawdust and wood scraps and empty finish cans, I felt something twist hard and cold in my chest, a grief turning into something far less passive. I waited until they left for lunch at a cafe down the street, then I walked over to the bag, pulled that journal out, and hid it under my jacket. I took it back to my house and locked myself in the bedroom I had shared with Tom for 30 years. That night, sitting on the edge of the bed with the journal in my lap, I opened it to the flyleaf just to see his handwriting again. It said, "Maggie, never stop building." I ran my finger over the ink and let myself cry for a few minutes, the kind of crying you do when you miss someone so specifically that the absence feels like a physical weight on your sternum. Then I started flipping through the pages, and as I turned to the back of the journal, a folded document slipped out from the pocket inside the rear cover, a document I had completely forgotten I had tucked there 3 years ago. It was the original notarized partnership agreement, my duplicate copy, the one I had kept when I nailed its twin under the feeder. The paper was heavy cream-colored bond with a slight tooth to it, still crisp at the edges from being pressed flat inside the journal all those years. My signature was there in blue rollerball ink, and Ethan's signature beside it, and beneath both of them was the clear embossed impression of Mrs. Hendricks's notary seal, her name and commission number and the county all raised into the paper in sharp relief. The date was 3 years earlier, and the terms were unmistakable. A 50-50 split between 2 named partners, requiring mutual written consent for any dissolution, any asset sale above $5,000, or any transfer of intellectual property rights. This document had never been superseded. No dissolution had ever been signed by me. Whatever Ethan had filed with the state was a pure fabrication built on a forged signature. I had the proof in my hands. Then, as I was about to close the journal, I turned to the very last page, the one right before the back cover, and I found something that made my breath stop in my throat. There was a note there in Tom's handwriting, dated exactly 2 weeks before the aneurysm that killed him. I had never seen this note before. I had no idea he had written anything beyond the flyleaf inscription. The note said, "Maggie, if anyone ever tries to steal your work, remember where you nailed the foundation. It will hold." He had written a date beneath it, and below the date he had drawn a tiny sketch of the barnwood feeder, the one I had built right after he gave me the journal. He had known. He had seen something coming, or maybe he had just known the kind of world we live in, and the kind of people who sometimes come out of it, and he had left me a clue tucked into the back of a book like a message in a bottle. I read that note 12 times, my vision blurring and clearing and blurring again, and by the time I set the journal down on the nightstand I was no longer a grieving widow. I was a woman with a plan. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that family and business need airtight legal protection, because what happened next would have been completely impossible without a properly notarized document and a husband who thought far enough ahead to leave breadcrumbs. Within a week of their dinner visit, Ethan and Sloane had me moved out of my own house and installed in their guest quarters, a converted pool cabana behind their 5-bedroom colonial revival in one of the newer subdivisions on the wealthy side of town. They framed it as an act of kindness, a way to keep an eye on me while I processed the grief of losing my company and to make sure I was eating properly and taking my medications. In reality, it was a control tactic designed to isolate me from my workshop, my records, my neighbors, and anyone who might help me. They took my car keys because the vehicle needed service, and they would handle it for me. They monitored my phone calls, with Sloane frequently drifting into the room whenever I was on the landline and asking who I was speaking with. They presented me with a thick envelope of documents they called a final settlement and release. The document had been drafted by a lawyer I had never met and had never spoken with. It stated that I acknowledged the partnership dissolution was legally valid, that I had received adequate consideration in the form of a one-time settlement payment, and that I forever waived and released any and all claims against the company, its assets, its intellectual property, and the proceeds from the avian accent sale. The settlement payment they were offering me, and I want you to sit with this number, was $3,600. The document actually specified that this payment was to be used for the purchase of a starter birdhouse kit of my choosing, as if I were a hobbyist retiree who needed a new craft project to keep her hands busy. I felt a pulse of rage so hot it made my vision narrow at the edges, but I forced myself to breathe slowly through my nose and nod, and tell them I would need some time to read it over carefully because my eyes were bad and the print was small. I asked them as sweetly as I could if they could possibly get me a copy of the dissolution papers that had been filed with the state, just so I could understand what I had apparently agreed to. Ethan hesitated and exchanged a glance with Sloane, but he eventually brought me a photocopy of the fraudulent dissolution, a single-page document with my supposed signature rendered in a typed cursive font, and a notary stamp that didn't match any legitimate notary in the state database, a detail I would confirm later. I began to observe them with the methodical patience of a naturalist studying a pair of invasive predators. The guest cabana had certain advantages that Ethan and Sloane had not considered when they installed me there. The walls were thin, and the main house's kitchen window faced the cabana door at a slight angle, which meant I could see the rhythms of their household from my little kitchenette while I sat with a mug of tea each morning. I began keeping a log in a small spiral notebook I kept hidden under the mattress. I noted the times of their phone calls, the visitors who came and went, the delivery trucks that arrived with furniture and boxes at all hours. Ethan took frantic phone calls on the back deck, his voice pitched low but strained in a way that carried across the patio. I heard him say things like, "The balloon payment is due in 60 days, I cannot stall them any longer, and if the avian accents wire doesn't clear escrow by month end, we are completely underwater on this." I filed away the phrase balloon payment, because I knew enough from listening to Tom talk about our mortgage years ago that a balloon payment meant a large lump sum debt obligation coming due all at once, and missing a balloon payment typically meant default and possible foreclosure or repossession. Sloane, in the meantime, was spending money as if the avian accents proceeds were already sitting in their checking account. She ordered an $8,000 sectional sofa in a pale beige performance velvet. She had a marble-topped kitchen island installed to replace the perfectly functional granite one that came with the house. She bought an antique armoire from an estate sale and had it delivered on a weekday afternoon, while Ethan was pacing the deck on another fraught phone call. Every single purchase was made on credit, and I could hear Sloane on her own calls telling friends and neighbors about their upcoming liquidity event and how they were planning to winter in St. Barth's. They were spending money they did not yet have, and the source of that money, the avian accents escrow, was stuck in a holding pattern that was becoming increasingly unstable. I learned more about the escrow situation through careful eavesdropping and some document snooping when I was left alone in the main house under the pretense of using their internet connection. The $510,000 from avian accents was sitting in escrow at a regional bank I will call Piedmont Commercial Trust. The purchase agreement required avian accents to receive clear title to all company assets and intellectual property, which meant the bank holding the escrow needed to verify several things before releasing the wire. They needed the filed articles of dissolution with the state business registry. They needed a notarized affidavit from Ethan affirming that he was the sole surviving member of the LLC with full authority to sell. And they needed the original partnership documentation from the company's inception to confirm that the dissolution had been executed properly and that no other member had a claim. Ethan had submitted the forged dissolution, and he had submitted the affidavit of sole ownership, but the original partnership agreement was a problem he could not solve. Avian Accent's legal team had apparently flagged the discrepancy and was demanding the partnership originals, the ones with the notarized signatures and the embossed seal. Ethan had told them the originals were lost, that he was working to produce certified copies, and that they should proceed with the wire based on the state's acceptance of his dissolution filing. The bank's compliance officer was not comfortable with that answer, and the escrow officer was slow-walking the release while their legal department reviewed the documentation. That gave me a window of time, but I didn't know how wide the window was or when it would slam shut. About 2 weeks into my captivity in the cabana, a small household disaster gave me an opportunity to demonstrate a skill set that Ethan and Sloane had completely discounted. The window in my kitchenette, an aluminum single-hung unit that looked out onto the side yard, jammed in the open position and refused to budge. Ethan came over with a butter knife and a can of WD-40 and spent 10 minutes prying at it ineffectively while muttering under his breath. He finally announced that he would have to call a handyman and that it might be a few days before someone could come out. I told him not to bother with the expense. I walked to the tiny storage closet where I kept Tom's old toolbox, the one I had insisted on bringing from my house despite Sloane's protests that I wouldn't need tools in the cabana. I retrieved a flathead screwdriver, a stiff putty knife, a small can of silicone spray lubricant, and a pair of needle-nose pliers. I had the sash freed and sliding smoothly in under 5 minutes. The track was gunked up with years of accumulated dust and pollen that had turned into a kind of adhesive paste, and the spring balance on the left side had slipped its retainer clip. I cleaned the track, popped the spring back into its clip with the pliers, sprayed the silicone lightly on the friction points, and showed Ethan how the window now opened with one finger. I didn't make a performance of it. I just fixed the thing and wiped my hands on a rag and went back to my tea. But I saw the flicker of surprise cross Sloane's face as she watched from the doorway, the momentary recalculation. They had seen me as a dardering widow who painted cute birds on wooden boxes. They had not accounted for the fact that I had been maintaining a century-old house for 30 years, that I had rebuilt a rotted porch deck and replaced a water heater by myself after Tom died, and that I understood how things worked at a mechanical level. The locked door to Ethan's home office became my next objective. He kept it bolted whenever he left the house, which was often, running errands he wouldn't explain and meeting with someone he referred to only as the lawyer on his phone calls. I had been inside his office once briefly, when he was looking for a document, and had left the door open, and I had seen a filing cabinet and a shredder and a desk covered in papers. I needed to get in there and see what he was hiding. Tom had worked as a locksmith's apprentice for 3 years in his early 20s before switching to the HVAC trade, and over the years he had taught me basic lockpicking as a hobby, the way other couples learn to dance the rumba or play tennis. We used to sit at the kitchen table in the evenings with a practice lock and a set of picks, and he would walk me through the mechanics of pin tumblers and shear lines and tension wrenches. I still had his old Southwood pick set, a small black nylon case containing a tension wrench, a half-diamond pick, a short hook, and a city rake. I kept it tucked into the lining of my sewing bag, which Ethan and Sloane had never searched because they didn't think a sewing bag could contain anything more threatening than embroidery floss. One afternoon when both of them were at a country club luncheon that Sloane had mentioned to me 3 times because she wanted me to know they were members, I let myself into the main house through the kitchen door they never locked during the day. I went to Ethan's office door and knelt down. The lock was a standard residential quickset, no security pins, no anti-pick features, the kind of lock that a determined amateur can rake open in under a minute with the right technique. I inserted the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway and applied light rotational pressure with my index finger, just enough to bind the pins. Then I slid the city rake into the keyway and began a rapid back and forth motion, bouncing the pins up and down against the shear line while maintaining that gentle turning pressure. On the 4th pass I felt the plug rotate smoothly and the bolt retracted with a satisfying click. I turned the handle and the door swung open into darkness. What I found inside that office was a landfill of financial wreckage hidden behind a surface-level appearance of order. The desk was clean, the monitor was dusted, the pen holder was neatly arranged, but the tall office shredder beside the filing cabinet had overflowed, and someone had emptied the bin, but neglected to clear the jammed strips from the cutting head. I pulled out a tangled wad of shredded paper and began laying the strips out on the carpet, matching torn edges the way you piece together a jigsaw puzzle. The first document I reconstructed was a loan agreement between Ethan and an online small business lender called Capfront Capital, dated 5 months earlier, long before the avian accent's offer. The principal was $82,000. The interest rate was 29.9% APRA, which is the kind of rate you only accept when you have no other options and you are desperate. The purpose of the loan was listed as business operating capital and inventory expansion, but I knew we hadn't expanded inventory significantly in that period, and our operating expenses were covered by our ongoing sales. The signature block for the personal guarantor bore my name. It was spelled correctly, Margaret J. Carlson, but the signature was a wobbly approximation of my handwriting that leaned too far to the right and had none of the distinctive loop I put on my capital M. He had forged my signature on a second document, this one a personal guarantee that would make me liable for the entire $82,000 plus interest and penalties if the loan went into default. The balloon payment, which was the entire remaining principal plus the accrued predatory interest, was due in 60 days from the date of the loan, which aligned almost exactly with the frantic phone calls I had been overhearing about the balloon payment being due soon. The loan was secured against the physical assets of Bluebird and Beam, our inventory and our equipment and our jigs, which meant if the avian accent's sale didn't close in time to pay off the loan, the lender could seize the company's assets, but more importantly, they could come after me personally for the deficiency balance because I was supposedly the guarantor. Ethan had not just stolen my company, he had set me up to take the fall for his own debt, leaving me legally responsible for $82,000 I had never known existed. I photographed every page of the reconstructed loan document with my phone, making sure the text was legible and the forged signature was clearly visible. I backed the photos up to a cloud storage account that Tom had set up years ago for our family photos, an account whose password Ethan had no way of knowing. Then I turned my attention to the filing cabinet. The top drawer was locked, but filing cabinet locks are even simpler than door locks, wafer tumblers that can be bypassed with a straightened paper clip in about 15 seconds. I popped the lock and slid the drawer open. Inside, in a hanging folder labeled Corporate Documents in Ethan's handwriting, I found the original forged dissolution agreement. It was a single-page template that had been downloaded from a legal document website, the kind where you fill in the blanks and pay $40 for a PDF. It listed me as the dissolving member, who was voluntarily surrendering all interest in the LLC in exchange for consideration of $1, a payment that had never been made and never been recorded and never even been offered. My signature was a typed cursive font, not an actual handwritten signature, which meant he had literally typed my name in a script font and called it a signature. The notary stamp was a rubber-stamped impression from a notary named Angela K. Morris with a commission number that, when I later looked it up in the state notary database, belonged to a completely different person whose commission had expired 2 years before the date on the document. The whole thing was laughably sloppy, a document that wouldn't survive 30 seconds of scrutiny from anyone who knew what to look for. Yet it had been enough to temporarily fool the State Business Registry's online filing system, which apparently didn't verify notary credentials beyond checking that a stamp image was present. It had been enough to get the dissolution recorded, at least provisionally. But it would not be enough to survive what I was about to unleash. I also found a folder of emails that Ethan had printed out, which was a stroke of luck, because it meant he was old enough to still print important correspondence. The printouts showed a chain of messages between Ethan and the Avian Accents acquisition manager, a woman named Cheryl Taggart. The tone of the emails shifted over the course of several weeks from cordial and enthusiastic to increasingly sharp and impatient. In one message from about 10 days before my office break-in, Cheryl had written, "Our legal team is flagging the dissolution documentation you provided. They are specifically requesting the original notarized partnership agreement from the company's inception, with both members' signatures and the notary's embossed seal. Without this document, we cannot verify that the dissolution was properly executed, and this sale cannot proceed to funding. Please provide the originals within 14 business days, or we will be forced to terminate the purchase agreement." Ethan had replied that the originals were lost in a storage unit flood, which I knew was a lie because our storage unit was on the second floor of a climate-controlled facility, and that he was working with his attorney to produce certified copies. Cheryl's follow-up response was blunt. "Certified copies must come from the notary of record or from the state archives, not from your attorney. Please provide the notary's contact information immediately." Ethan had not replied to that email, at least not in the printed chain, which meant he had likely panicked and was trying to figure out a way around the problem. That night, after I had replaced everything exactly as I found it and relocked both the cabinet and the office door, I sat in my cabana with the lights off and made a list of the people I needed to contact. First, I needed to find Mrs. Hendricks. Second, I needed to talk to the bank's compliance officer. Third, I needed to make contact with law enforcement at a level that could handle interstate wire fraud. I started with Mrs. Hendricks. I found her number in an old address book I had brought from my house, a spiral-bound book with cross-outs and updates in different inks spanning 2 decades. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice warm and slightly surprised to hear from me. She was retired now, living with her daughter in a small town about 2 hours west, but she remembered me and the partnership signing with remarkable clarity. She said it was the only time in her 30-year notary career that she had notarized a business agreement in a kitchen that smelled like fresh-sawn cedar, and that she remembered Ethan's arrogant smile and my careful way of reading every line before I signed. I asked her if she had ever notarized a dissolution document for Ethan Riggs or for Bluebird and Beam LLC. There was a long pause on the line, and then she said very carefully, "Mrs. Carlson, I have never notarized a dissolution for your company. I have not seen your nephew or any documents related to your business since the day I signed your original partnership, and I still have my notary journal from that year, which shows every notarization I performed, the date, the type of document, and the signers' names. There is no dissolution entry in my journal, not on that date or any other." I asked her if she would be willing to provide a sworn affidavit to that effect. She said she would be delighted, and she gave me her daughter's mailing address so I could have a courier pick up the affidavit once she had drafted it. Through Mrs. Hendrix's connections in the local legal community. She gave me the name of the bank compliance officer at Piedmont Commercial Trust, who was overseeing the Avian Accents escrow. His name was Marcus Delgado, and he had been with the bank's fraud investigation unit for 12 years before moving into commercial escrow compliance. I called him from a prepaid burner phone I had bought with cash at a gas station convenience store, using a story about being a concerned business associate who had information about a potentially fraudulent escrow transaction. He was initially guarded, citing client confidentiality and bank policy, but when I mentioned Ethan Riggs and the Bluebird and Beam acquisition, and the words forged dissolution, his tone shifted from professional distance to sharp attention. He said, "Ma'am, I cannot confirm or deny any specific account details, but I can tell you that if you are in possession of an original notarized partnership document that contradicts a filed dissolution, and if you are willing to bring that document forward, you need to do so immediately. Forgery of a dissolution document for the purpose of securing a wire transfer across state lines is a federal offense under the wire fraud statute, and we take that very seriously in this institution." I told him I was in a delicate personal situation and that the person who had filed the fraudulent dissolution was currently monitoring my movements. He lowered his voice and said, "I'm going to give you a direct phone number for the FBI's white-collar crime division in our district. Call them, tell them exactly what you've told me. They are already building a case file on something adjacent to this. I can't say more, but your information will be helpful." The FBI agent I spoke with was a woman named Agent Reeves, and she listened to my entire story without interruption while I sat in the bathroom of the cabana with the shower running to mask my voice. I told her about the forged loan guarantee, the fake dissolution, the pending escrow wire, the fact that I had both originals of the partnership agreement, and that I could prove the dissolution was fraudulent. When I finished, there was a pause, and then she said, "Mrs. Carlson, I'm going to be straight with you. We have been investigating your nephew for about 3 months now. The online lender he used, Capfront Capital, has an internal fraud detection system that flagged his loan application for potential elder financial exploitation. The age of the supposed guarantor, that's you, combined with the signature discrepancies, and the fact that the loan was taken out without any direct contact with the guarantor, triggered their reporting obligation under the Senior Safe Act. We've been building a file quietly, but we need more evidence to move from investigation to arrest. If you can provide us with the original partnership document and a sworn affidavit from your notary, and if you are willing to be present at the bank when Ethan attempts the final signing to release the escrow funds, we can catch him in the act of making false statements to a federally insured financial institution. That triggers about 7 different statutes, and it gives us grounds for immediate arrest and asset seizure." She asked me if I was willing to be part of a controlled operation at the bank. I told her I would do whatever was necessary. I now had the evidence, I had the allies, and I had a clear picture of the trap that was being set. But there was one more piece I needed to secure, the physical backup that Tom had written about in his note. The feeder was still hanging in my garden behind my real house, the house Ethan had convinced me to leave with promises that he would maintain the property while I was staying in the cabana. I borrowed a neighbor's car one morning under the pretense of a follow-up appointment with my eye doctor, an appointment I had actually scheduled to create a legitimate reason to be out of the house. I drove to my property, parked in the driveway, and walked around to the back garden. The feeder was still there, hanging from a black iron bracket I had mounted on the garden shed. 3 years of weather had darkened the barn wood further, and the marine varnish had developed a slight amber patina, but the structure was solid and the roof had shed water perfectly. I reached underneath the roof overhang, felt the plastic sleeve still in place exactly where I had nailed it, the galvanized roofing nail still tight and rust-free. I didn't remove it. I didn't need to, because I already had the identical original from the journal. I just needed to know it was there, that the foundation had physically survived just as the legal foundation had survived. I stood in my garden for a long moment, looking at the empty birdhouses hanging around me, the ones that had held bluebird families every spring since Tom died, and I felt something settle into place in my chest, a cold certainty that replaced the grief and the fear. The maximum cruelty beat came 2 days later, and it was the moment that erased any residual family feeling I still carried for my nephew. I had decided to test Ethan and Sloane, to see if there was any human decency left beneath the financial predation, any flicker of the boy I had babysat and helped with his science fair projects, and taught to use a coping saw. I waited until an afternoon when I knew they were both home, Ethan in the kitchen scrolling through his phone and Sloane in the living room unpacking a delivery box. I walked into the kitchen, stopped about 6 feet from where Ethan was standing, and I staged a collapse. I clutched my chest with both hands, the way Tom had done in his last conscious moment, and I let my knees buckle. I crashed hard to the tile floor, landing on my hip and shoulder, and I began moaning and gasping in a way that I knew from experience looked terrifyingly real. I had seen an aneurysm happen. I knew exactly how to fake it. Ethan rounded the kitchen island, and for 1/2 second I thought I saw alarm on his face, the normal human response. But his eyes did not go to my face or my chest or my pulse point. His eyes went immediately to the manila folder I had deliberately dropped on the floor beside me as I fell, the folder I had prepared earlier containing a printed copy of the Front Capital loan document with my forged signature highlighted in yellow. He stepped right over my body. His loafer actually brushed against the sleeve of my cardigan as he stepped across me to snatch that folder off the floor. He opened it, saw what it was, and his expression shifted from alarm to something I can only describe as cold calculation. He looked down at me, still gasping on the tile, and he said, "Get up, you're fine, stop being dramatic." Then he walked out of the kitchen with the folder under his arm. Sloane came in about 30 seconds later, looked at me lying there and said, "Oh, for heaven's sake," before she finally pulled out her phone and dialed 911. She waited until the operator answered before she even knelt down beside me, and before the paramedics arrived, she had gone to find Ethan and retrieve the folder from him. They hid it in the pantry behind a bag of flour, which I saw from my position on the floor. The paramedics checked my vitals, found nothing wrong, and offered to transport me to the hospital for observation. I went because it maintained the ruse, and because I wanted to see how they would react when I was wheeled out. From the ambulance gurney, I looked back through the rear windows at Ethan and Sloane, standing in the doorway of their beautiful house. They were not watching me with concern. They were watching me with the flat, evaluative stares of people, calculating how much longer they would have to maintain this pretense before they could be rid of me entirely. That was the moment I stopped thinking of Ethan as my nephew. He became a hostile operator, and I was no longer his aging aunt. I was a problem he needed to eliminate, and I intended to make sure the elimination went in the opposite direction. The confrontation arrived exactly 1 week later, and it was orchestrated with the precision of a closing scene in a legal thriller. Ethan came to the cabana on a Thursday morning, visibly excited in a way that made my stomach clench. He said the bank had finally resolved all the outstanding issues with the escrow documentation, that the funds were ready to be released, and that all I had to do was come to the bank with him and sign one final form, an affidavit of sole ownership that would confirm Ethan as the sole surviving member of the LLC with full authority to receive the wire transfer. He had apparently convinced the bank that I was a confused elderly relative who needed to be physically present for a simple notarization, just a formality, nothing to worry about. Sloane came over with a cardigan she had picked out for me, a soft beige thing with wooden buttons that made me look passive and grandmotherly and harmless. She helped me into it and patted my shoulder and said, "This will all be over soon, Margaret. Then you can really rest." They drove me to the downtown commercial branch of Piedmont Commercial Trust, a granite-faced building with brass fixtures and heavy oak doors. The conference room they led us to was all paneled walls and a long polished table, and a flat-screen monitor on the wall showing a summary of the escrow account. Marcus Delgado was there, tall and composed in a charcoal suit, and beside him sat a younger woman in a navy blazer who I recognized from her voice as Agent Reeves, though she was introduced to Ethan as the bank's outside legal counsel. 2 other men in suits were seated at the far end of the table, representatives from Avian Accents who had been asked to attend the final signing. Ethan slid the affidavit across the table toward me, a crisp white document with a signature line at the bottom and a notary acknowledgement block below that. He uncapped a pen and placed it beside the document, beaming at me with the same rehearsed affection he had been deploying for weeks. "Just sign here, Aunt Maggie," he said, "and this whole thing is done. You'll be taken care of, I promise." The room was silent. I could hear the faint hum of the HVAC system and the distant clicking of a keyboard somewhere down the hallway. I looked at the paper. I looked at the pen. Then I looked at Ethan and I let the mask of the confused, compliant widow drop away completely. I pushed my glasses up my nose and I said, in a voice that was clear and steady and louder than necessary, "I will not sign away a company that I built with my own hands, funded with my husband's life insurance, and protected with a notarized agreement that you forged your way around. Especially not when you also forged my signature on an $82,000 loan guarantee and set me up to take the fall for your debt when the balloon payment comes due. Ethan's smile froze in place, then slowly collapsed like a tent with the poles kicked out. He started to say something about confusion and old age and stress, but I was already reaching into my purse. I pulled out the original notarized partnership agreement, still crisp in its folded state, and I laid it flat on the polished table. The overhead lights caught the raised impression of Mrs. Hendricks's embossed seal, the circular indentation with her name and commission number clearly legible in the paper. "This is the original 50-50 partnership agreement," I said, turning it so Delgado and Agent Reeves could see it clearly. "Signed at my kitchen table in front of a notary public, whose affidavit is already on file with this bank. The dissolution document that Ethan filed with the state is a forgery. The signature on that document is a typed cursive font, not a human hand, and the notary stamp belongs to a notary whose commission expired 2 years before the date on the page. The loan guarantee he submitted to Capfront Capital bears my forged signature as well, which means he has committed wire fraud, identity theft, and elder financial exploitation, all of which are federal offenses." Agent Reeves stood up and produced her credentials from inside her blazer, a black leather case with a gold badge and an identification card. She identified herself as Special Agent Reeves of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, White-Collar Crime Division, and she informed Ethan that he was being detained pending formal arrest on multiple counts. The 2 men at the end of the table, who I had assumed were Avian Accent's representatives, stood up as well and revealed themselves as additional federal agents. Ethan went the color of old milk. He started stammering something about a misunderstanding and an overreaction, but Agent Reeves was already reciting the charges in a flat professional tone, while one of the other agents moved behind Ethan's chair. Sloane, who had been standing near the door, made a sound like a stepped-on cat, and started to say something about calling their attorney, but a 4th agent appeared in the doorway and took her by the arm and led her out into the hallway. The whole thing was quiet and swift and utterly without drama. Handcuffs clicked into place. Phones and wallets were confiscated and bagged. The Avian Accent's wire was frozen by the bank within the hour, the escrow terminated, the purchase agreement declared void due to fraud on the part of the seller. The Capfront Capital loan was flagged as fraudulent and the personal guarantee was voided, and I received written confirmation from the lender within 72 hours that I bore no liability for any of Ethan's debts. My company, my inventory, my designs, my intellectual property, all of it reverted to me by operation of law because the dissolution had never legally occurred. The aftermath was a slow and deeply satisfying unwinding of everything Ethan and Sloane had tried to build on the foundation of their fraud. Ethan was charged with 2 counts of wire fraud, 1 count of aggravated identity theft, 1 count of forgery, and 1 count of elder financial abuse under North Carolina's specific statute, protecting vulnerable adults from exploitation by family members. The federal prosecutor assigned to the case, a sharp woman in her 40s who reminded me of Tom's favorite cousin, told me that the evidence I had provided was so comprehensive and so well documented that Ethan's public defender recommended a plea agreement almost immediately. He pled guilty to all counts in exchange for a reduced sentence recommendation and an agreement to pay restitution. The judge, a stern man with a reputation for disliking financial predators, sentenced him to 4 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release, and a restitution order totaling $134,000, which covered my legal fees, the lost business income during the period when the company was in escrow limbo, and the damages from the fraudulent loan. Sloane received a plea deal with 18 months of probation, a $15,000 fine, and a permanent injunction barring her from acting as a fiduciary or financial manager for any person over the age of 60. The last I heard, she was working as a receptionist at a tanning salon in a strip mall 2 towns over, her cashmere wardrobe sold on consignment, and her country club membership revoked. Piedmont Commercial Trust filed its own civil complaint against Ethan for attempted fraud against a federally insured institution, which added additional pressure and ensured that his restitution payments would be garnished from any future earnings for years to come. Avian Accent sent me a formal letter of apology on their corporate letterhead, expressing regret for their role in the near acquisition and indicating that they would be interested in exploring a legitimate wholesale relationship with my company once the legal dust had fully settled. I restructured the LLC under a new name, one that felt appropriate given what had happened. A friend of mine from the local small business association, a trademark attorney who had followed my case with a mixture of professional interest and personal outrage, handled the name change and the new trademark registration at cost because she said the story was too good to charge full price for. Wing of Deceit Birdhouses was born. I liquidated the old inventory that Ethan had earmarked for avian accents, sold it through my own website and a few loyal boutique retailers who had stood by me through the whole ordeal, and used the proceeds to relaunch with a direct-to-consumer model that cut out the middlemen entirely. I built a new website with professional product photography and a blog where I wrote about woodworking techniques and native bird conservation and the importance of keeping your business paperwork in order. Sales were steady but modest for the first few months. Then I negotiated something that was equal parts catharsis and public accountability, and it changed the trajectory of the business completely. Ethan's work release program, which was part of his federal sentence, allowed him to leave the prison facility during weekday daytime hours to perform court-ordered community service and restitution labor. My attorney, a woman named Diane who had handled my civil case with a ferocity that I deeply appreciated, petitioned the court to allow Ethan to serve those work release hours in my workshop, directly performing the menial labor of Birdhouse production under supervision, with all hours credited toward his restitution debt. The judge reviewed the petition, noted the poetic justice of the arrangement, and approved it with the condition that the work be transparent and that the public be allowed to verify that the restitution was genuinely being performed. So now, 4 days a week, Ethan Riggs sits at a bench in the corner of my refurbished workshop, wearing a fluorescent yellow safety vest with the words "Nest of Lies" printed across the back in bold black block lettering that is visible from 20 feet away. His job is to drill the entry holes into the front panels of the bluebird houses. He uses a drill press with a 1.5-inch Forstner bit, and he drills precisely 80 entry holes per shift, which is about 10 houses worth of fronts. A uniformed corrections officer sits in a folding chair near the door, monitoring his work and ensuring he doesn't interact with the other employees or with customers. On Fridays, the workshop is open to the public for tours, because I insist on complete transparency about what we do and how we do it, and who is drilling our holes. Every single birdhouse that ships from Wing of Deceit Birdhouses includes a small card printed on recycled craft paper about the size of a business card, with a QR code in the center. When you scan that code with your phone, it takes you to a page on the federal court's public access system that displays Ethan's full conviction record, the charges, the plea agreement, the sentencing order, and a current photo of him in the Nest of Lies vest. Some people have told me this is harsh, that humiliation is not a necessary component of justice. Most of my customers tell me it is the specific reason they chose to buy from me instead of from a mass-market retailer that sells imported birdhouses made from dubious materials. Sales tripled in the first 6 months after the news coverage of the trial, and the work release arrangement went viral in home and garden circles. I now employ 4 local woodworkers, 3 of them women over 50 who had been out of the workforce for years and needed flexible schedules and a workplace that respected their skills. I pay them well above the average for the region, and I provide health insurance and retirement contributions, which Ethan had always said was too expensive for a small business. I set up a small charitable foundation, funded by a percentage of the sales from each Nest of Lies series birdhouse, that provides free legal aid and forensic accounting services to seniors who are facing financial fraud perpetrated by family members. We have helped 17 people so far, and every one of their thank you letters goes into a folder that I keep on my desk next to Tom's journal. I am 55 years old now, and my hands are still covered in sawdust and linseed oil on most days. I still have Tom's journal open on my desk, turned to the last page, where his handwriting still says, "Maggie, if anyone ever tries to steal your work, remember where you nailed the foundation. It will hold." I still have the barnwood feeder hanging outside the new workshop, mounted on a post where everyone can see it, the original partnership agreement still nailed underneath in its plastic sleeve, sealed against the weather. I don't think about revenge in the angry sense anymore, but I do think about foundations every single day. The things you build when nobody is watching. The agreements you notarize not because you expect betrayal, but because you understand that clarity is a form of love, and that proper paperwork is a form of protection for everyone involved. Ethan was the flashy nephew with the sales pitch, and the hidden debt, and the forged signatures. I was the quiet aunt who knew how to rabbit a joint that would hold through a hurricane, and how to hide a document in a place where only the faithful would ever find it. In the end, the entire scheme collapsed because he underestimated two things: my competence and my husband's foresight. He thought he was stealing from a confused widow who painted birds and cried over old photographs. He was actually trying to rob a woman who had spent 30 years learning to build things that could not be broken. Integrity required only that I remember where I had put the nail. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? If this story resonated with you, if you believe that the truth is always worth protecting, and that clear boundaries and proper documentation are an essential form of self-respect, then please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. We share new stories of quiet justice every week, and every subscription helps us bring more of these narratives to people who need to hear them. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.